Out. For 8 years, Colin Mercer patched what Diane Stoll's company quietly broke. Every defective unit her construction supply chain tried to bury. The ones with hairline fractures in the load brackets, the ones that failed torque testing on and disappeared from the inventory logs by Thursday, ended up in a rented storage bay behind his welding shop on the east edge of Harlan, Kentucky. No contracts, no company letterhead. Out. Just Colin, his acetylene torch, and a daughter who did her homework on the parts counter while the grinder ran. He never complained. He kept every receipt, every photo, every handwritten note about what had been wrong and how he had fixed it. And when Diane Stoll's company finally came apart in front of a federal safety board, she had nowhere left to go but a sheet metal shop in a coal town she had never visited, run by a man she had treated like a disposal service. Out. He had repaired everything she sent him. Now she needed him to repair the one thing she could not ship in a crate, the truth about how long she had known. The town of Harlan sat in the southeastern corner of Kentucky the way a stone sits at the bottom of a creek bed, settled and permanent and shaped by everything that had passed over it. Out. Mercer Fabrication and Repair occupied a corrugated steel building on Cutter Road, across from a feed supply store that had been closed for 3 years and a Baptist church that had not. Colin had painted the address on the front wall himself, white letters on green, and had never repainted it even after the winter the drainage ditch flooded and left a brown waterline across the lower half of the building like a bathtub ring. There were more important things to fix. Out. He was at the shop by 5:30 most mornings. His daughter Hazel was 11, old enough to get herself to the bus stop, and sharp enough to know that her father's early hours were not negotiable. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a habit of leaving notes on the refrigerator in handwriting that tilted severely to the right, as though the letters were leaning into wind. Out. The notes said things like "bus at 7, don't forget, and we are out of the good cereal again," and occasionally just hi with a drawing of whatever she was thinking about that week. Her mother, Joanna, had died of a brain aneurysm 9 months after Hazel was born. She had been 31 years old and had been standing in the kitchen at 6 in the evening, and then she was not standing anymore. Out. Colin had carried the weight of that fact every day since, not dramatically, not visibly, just as a permanent condition of his existence, the way a healed fracture changes the density of bone. He opened the shop at 6, made coffee in a dented percolator that sat on a plywood shelf near the electrical panel, and began the day's work. Most of it was routine, agricultural equipment, truck frames, structural repairs for small contractors up and down the valley. Out. The kind of work that kept a business alive without making anyone rich. The first delivery from Stoll Infrastructure Solutions had arrived 8 years ago on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. A white cargo van, no company markings, driven by a man who did not offer his name. He unloaded 4 fabricated load-bearing brackets from the back, stacked them on a pallet, and handed Colin a sealed envelope. Out. Inside was cash and a single index card with a production lot number written in blue ballpoint. No instructions beyond what was implied. Fix them and don't ask why they're here instead of a licensed repair facility. Colin had examined the brackets that evening. They were structural components used in modular building systems, the kind of commercial construction hardware that went into prefabricated warehouses and distribution centers. Out. The welds on 2 of them showed microscopic porosity that he recognized from the angle of the fracture pattern, a problem with the shielding gas mixture during the original manufacturing process. It was fixable. It was also the kind of defect that should have been caught at the source, not shipped quietly to a one-man shop in Appalachian, Kentucky. He took the money. He fixed the brackets. Out. He photographed each one before and after and wrote a 2-page technical summary of what he had found. The kind of notes he would have written for any job, because writing things down was simply how his mind worked. He put the photographs and the notes in a manila folder, labeled it with the lot number and the date, and filed it in the gray metal cabinet in the back corner of the shop. He did that every time a delivery came. Out. His bookkeeper was a retired school administrator named Paulette Odom, who had lived in Harlan her entire life, and who managed Colin's invoicing and payroll taxes from a desk in the front office with the focused intensity of someone diffusing ordnance. She was 64 years old and had no patience for disorder of any kind. Out. She had started noticing the pattern in the deliveries during the 2nd year, when the lot numbers began to cluster in a way that suggested not random returns but a systematic problem with a specific production line. She brought it to Colin on a Tuesday morning with a printout of her own analysis, organized into columns with headers she had typed in bold. Colin looked at it for a long time. "I know," he said. Out. "How long have you known?" "Since the 4th delivery." Paulette adjusted her reading glasses. "And you're just filing it." "I'm filing it," he said. She looked at him over the rims of the glasses with the expression she had once used on 7th graders who thought they were being clever. Then she took the printout back to her desk, made a second copy, and put it in her own folder. which she kept in the locked drawer on the left side of her desk. Neither of them discussed why. Out. The back room of Mercer Fabrication held 2 6-drawer flat file cabinets and a row of 3-ring binders on a shelf above the parts washer, each one labeled by year. Colin had chosen gray for the cabinets because it was the only color available at the surplus sale where he had bought them, and because he was not the kind of man who thought much about color choices. Out. But every time he opened the room, the gray reminded him of the engineering lab at Stoll's regional facility in Lexington, where he had worked for 6 years before the company restructured and eliminated his department. Colin Mercer had been a structural engineer before he was a shop owner. He had a degree from the University of Kentucky and had spent those 6 years designing load-bearing components for modular construction systems. Out. He had been precise and methodical and had flagged problems early, which was valued right up until the moment it became inconvenient. The problem he had flagged 14 months before his position was eliminated was a manufacturing defect in the SB7 bracket series caused by a vendor change in the shielding gas supplier. He had written a formal internal report, submitted it to his division manager, a man named Arthur Greer, and waited. Out. Arthur Greer had acknowledged the report and then done nothing that Colin could see. 3 months later, Colin's position was listed among the 15 eliminated in what the company called a strategic realignment. He had not connected the dots completely until the first delivery arrived and he saw the lot number on the index card. The brackets in that first crate were from the SB7 series. Out. He opened the garage instead of a lawsuit, because a lawsuit required money and documentation and a lawyer willing to take on a company that employed 400 people and had a legal team on retainer. He had none of those things. He had a baby daughter and a shop he was renting month to month and a cabinet's worth of notes that no one had asked to see. Out. So he had waited without planning to wait because every week there was too much immediate work to think about anything else, and every year Hazel got a year older, and the folders in the cabinet multiplied, and the lot numbers kept matching the fault pattern he had documented in a report that Arthur Greer had signed for and then made disappear. The recall notice came out on a Monday morning in February. Hazel was at school. Paulette was at her desk. Out. Colin was in the middle of a frame repair on a landscaping trailer when his phone buzzed with a news alert and he set down the MIG gun and read the headline twice. 14 incidents across 9 states, 3 injuries, 1 fatality, all involving structural failure in modular warehouse systems built with components from Stoll Infrastructure Solutions SB Series production run. He knew exactly which production run. Out. He walked to the back room and stood in front of the flat file cabinets for a moment with his hands at his sides. Then he went back to the trailer and finished the frame repair because the customer was picking it up at noon. Paulette found him after the customer left. She was holding her phone in both hands. "I counted our folders," she said. "We have 61 deliveries over 8 years. Out. Every lot number I cross-referenced is in the affected production run." Colin wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I know, Colin. I know, Paulette." She set the phone on the workbench and looked at him in a way that required him to look back. "This is not a tax record anymore," she said. "This is a federal safety investigation." He nodded. He already knew that. He had known it on some level since the 4th delivery. Out. Stoll Infrastructure Solutions occupied a glass office complex on the west side of Lexington. Diane Stoll had inherited operational control of the company from her father 8 years ago at 34, and had spent those years expanding its footprint into commercial construction markets that her father had never touched. She was rigorous and fast-moving and had a reputation in the industry for running meetings that started on time and ended with decisions. Out. But she was sitting in her office at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night with the lights low and a stack of legal briefs on the desk in front of her, and the only decision she could identify was one she had not made and could not undo. She had read everything her legal team had sent. Out. She had read the recall notice, the incident reports, the preliminary investigation summary, and she had read, this was the part that stayed, an internal memo from 7 years ago flagging a weld defect in the SB7 series. The memo had been written by a structural engineer in her Lexington facility. His name was Colin Mercer. The memo had been received and initialed by Arthur Greer, her former division manager, who was now on administrative leave and not returning calls. Out. Her attorney, a measured and precise woman named Sandra Fitch, had laid it out plainly. To establish that the concealment had occurred below the executive level, she needed an independent technical witness who had handled the affected components and could speak to the fault pattern from outside the company's own records. The only person who met that description based on a parts reference buried in an 8-year-old logistics file was a shop owner in Harlan, Kentucky. Diane drove herself. Out. She had not driven herself anywhere longer than 12 minutes in 5 years, and the route to Harlan was 2 hours through mountain roads she did not know. She left at 7 in the morning and arrived at Cutter Road shortly before 9. Colin was cutting a section of square tube when the black sedan pulled into the gravel lot. Out. He heard the engine and the door and the sound of footsteps on gravel that had a deliberate, unhurried quality, as though the person had made a decision and was walking toward it. He set down the cutting wheel and pushed his safety glasses up. She looked like her company photo, but without whatever had been holding the photo's posture together. The suit was correct. Out. The rest of her showed the particular compression that comes from 3 days of not sleeping and 6 days of reading documents that implicate people who worked for you. Colin Mercer, she said. Not a question. You drove yourself, he said. It was an observation, not a welcome. She looked at him steadily. I did. He set the piece of tube on the bench and dusted metal shavings from his forearm. 8 years I've been receiving your defective components. Out. Nobody ever introduced themselves before now. The sentence was not an accusation. It was a ledger entry. It described a condition. She told him what she needed. A technical witness. A chain of documentation proving the defect was manufacturing origin and predated her operational tenure. Someone outside the company who had handled the affected units and could establish that the problem had been known, concealed, and routed away from regulatory review. Colin listened without expression. Out. What are you offering, he said. She named a figure. He looked past her to the gravel lot where Hazel, home early for a teacher workday, was sitting on an overturned plastic crate drawing in a sketchbook with the focused absorption of a child who has learned to keep herself occupied. That's not what I need, he said. Out. Then what? He looked back at Diane with the directness of someone who has spent 8 years in a room with data that contradicts the official version of events, and has therefore lost the patience for any version of talking around things. I need you to sit in that room, he said, and nodded toward the back, and look at 8 years of records with me, and when you're done, I need you to tell me honestly whether you knew. She did not answer immediately. Out. The gravel lot was quiet except for the sound of Hazel's pencil scratching across paper. Then the door from the lot opened and Hazel came in, not self-consciously, just moving through the shop the way she always did, like someone who had grown up in it, which she had. She looked at Diane with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to soften her evaluation. Are you the lady from the news? She said. Hazel, Colin said. It's fine, Diane said. She looked at the girl. Out. I don't know. It depends which story. Hazel considered this. The one about the buildings falling down, she said. My dad fixed the parts. He told me. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms when a child has said something that the adults in the room have been circling for an hour. Go draw outside, Colin said. Hazel picked up her sketchbook without urgency and went back through the door. Out. The gravel crunched once under her shoes and then was quiet. The flat file cabinets took 3 hours to go through. Colin pulled folders in chronological order, setting each one on the steel workbench under the fluorescent light, and walked Diane through the documentation the same way he would walk a new hire through a maintenance log, without emphasis or drama, just sequentially, because that was how the data organized itself. Out. Each folder contained photographs taken before and after the repair, a written fault analysis describing the specific failure mode and its probable origin, and a cross-reference to the lot number and production date. The photographs were dated with a rubber stamp. The analysis forms were handwritten and signed. Diane had spent the previous week reading her own company's records. She recognized the lot numbers. Most of them were now on the federal recall list. Out. By the time Colin closed the final cabinet drawer, she was sitting on the steel stool with a folder open in her lap, and her expression had shifted in a way that was hard to categorize precisely. It was the look of someone who had held a version of a story until the version stopped being credible. Arthur received your original memo, she said. Before the restructuring. 7 months before, Colin said. And then 14 months after I was let go, the first delivery showed up here. Out. 3 brackets from the SB7 line. Same fault I documented. He was routing them here because I had the skills to handle them quietly and the need for income. Colin leaned against the cabinet with his arms crossed, and because if anything surfaced, a small-town welder taking cash payments under the table makes a much worse witness than an executive. He knew that. He factored it in. Diane set the folder on the bench. Out. Outside, somewhere in the lot, Hazel was humming something toneless and repetitive that drifted through the gap on the side door. How old is she? Diane asked. 11, Colin said. The silence had weight. He let it have it. I'm sorry, Diane said finally. For Hazel or for me? She didn't answer right away. He respected that. An instant answer would have been the wrong kind. She stayed in Harlan. Out. There was nowhere viable to go. The media had her Lexington building surrounded, and Sandra Fitch had told her to stay out of reach until the preliminary submission was ready. She took a room at the motel on the north end of town, the one with the hand-painted cardinal on the sign, and came to the shop each morning at 8. They worked through the records together, Colin and Diane and Paulette, constructing a timeline that ran from his original internal memo to the most recent delivery 2 months prior. Paulette cross-referenced lot numbers against the federal recall inventory with a yellow highlighter and a level of concentration usually associated with air traffic control. On the second morning, Diane picked up a wire brush from the bench and held it backward. Colin reached over and turned it around without comment. She registered the correction and applied it without making anything of it, which told him something about her that her posture in the first meeting had not. By the third day, she had stopped wearing the suit jacket. By the fourth, she had brought coffee for all 3 of them without being asked. Hazel, who had been watching all of this from the parts counter with the patient attention of a child raised around adults conducting serious business, finally addressed Diane directly on the 5th afternoon. "You're staying at the Cardinal Motel," she said. "I am," Diane said. "The vending machine on the 2nd floor is broken. It keeps the money. I found that out." Hazel appeared to consider whether this established sufficient mutual hardship for further conversation. She decided it did. "My dad has extra granola bars," she said. "In the desk drawer. He won't tell you, but you can just take one." Colin did not look up from the bench. "You can take one," he confirmed. Diane took a granola bar. It was the smallest transaction that had occurred in the building all week and the most uncomplicated. On the 6th evening, Paulette called Colin from the shop at 10:47. She had stayed late to finish the lot number cross-reference and had gone back through the earliest folders to confirm the production dates. Her voice on the phone was even, which meant she was working to keep it that way. "Come back," she said. "Now." The folder she showed him was from the second summer of deliveries, 18 months into the arrangement. A standard delivery receipt for 5 SB7 units. Stapled to the back of the receipt in an envelope that had been tucked into the inner flap and missed on every previous review was a single sheet of Stoll Infrastructure letterhead. The handwriting was Arthur Greer's. Colin had seen it on enough internal memos to be certain. The note read, "Route these outside normal returns. Keep them off the Q3 audit." The production lot on the receipt matched the engine series that had been installed in a distribution warehouse in eastern Tennessee. A structural failure in that building's support framework 14 months prior had injured a 26-year-old dock worker named Spencer Pruitt, who had been on his 2nd week at the job. Spencer Pruitt had not returned to work. His case was listed in the federal incident report under the category of serious injury, defined as requiring hospitalization and resulting in permanent functional limitation. Colin read the note twice. He set it on the bench under the lamp and looked at it. Diane arrived 15 minutes later. She stood at the bench and read the note and did not say anything for longer than felt comfortable, and then said, "He used your shop as a storage unit, because he trusted that you'd keep everything and never connect it." "He thought I didn't have the key," Colin said. The call to Sandra Fitch went out at 11:15. By the following morning, the legal team had begun compiling the submission package, 8 years of lot-coded repair records, the original internal memo from 7 years ago, the note on Stoll letterhead, and Colin's formal technical analysis establishing the causal chain between the manufacturing defect, the concealment, and the incidents in the federal report. Arthur Greer arrived at Mercer Fabrication on a Thursday morning, unannounced. He drove a silver SUV and parked it with the precision of a man who still believed that precision communicated authority. He was wearing a sport coat that cost more than 2 weeks of Colin's materials budget, and he had the expression of someone preparing to negotiate with someone who did not yet understand their position. Colin was at the bench. He did not stand. Arthur made the offer without preamble, the way he had always operated. A specific number, a specific ask. The note from the folder, and Colin's characterization of the deliveries as informal contracted work rather than off-book disposal. In return, the company would formalize the past payments as legitimate contract income, file the corrected tax documentation retroactively, and the news item that had been circulating online. A short piece sourced anonymously that framed Colin as a financially compromised witness with a history of accepting unreported cash would be retracted because that was the other thing that had happened. 3 days after the recall story broke, a piece had appeared on a regional news aggregator describing a Harlan shop owner with an undisclosed cash payment history from the same company now under federal investigation. It had described Colin's arrangement with Stoll as potentially indicative of complicity rather than documentation. 2 of his regular customers had called Paulette to postpone their job. He had not said anything to Hazel about it, but she had read it on a classmate's phone during lunch and had come home and sat with him on the porch steps for 20 minutes, without saying anything, and then gone inside to make dinner, which she was not old enough to do well, but which she did anyway. Colin listened to Arthur's offer in its entirety. Then he said, "Do you know a man named Spencer Pruitt?" Arthur said nothing. 26 years old, Colin said. He was on the job 2 weeks. Out. Warehouse in Cock County, Tennessee. The load bracket that failed came from a lot you sent me. The note in your handwriting told me to keep it off the Q3 audit. He picked up a weld gauge from the bench and held it, not to demonstrate anything, just to have something in his hand. I read the local news. I've been reading it for 8 years. I keep track of things people assume nobody's watching. Arthur tried once more. My legal team, get out of my shop, Colin said. Out. His voice did not change register. I have a job starting at 9. Arthur Greer stood in the center of Mercer Fabrication and looked at the room. The tools on their pegboard, the flat file cabinets visible through the open back door, the parts counter where a child's sketchbook sat open to a drawing of a bird that was probably a cardinal. Out. He looked at all of it and understood, with the particular clarity available only to people who have spent their careers leveraging other people's vulnerability, that there was nothing here to leverage. A man who has already lost the most important thing does not negotiate over lesser ones. He left without further comment. His SUV pulled out of the lot with the same precision it had arrived with, and then the gravel settled and the lot was quiet. Out. Diane had been standing at the far side of the building. She had heard everything. When Colin came out to the lot, she was leaning against the corrugated wall with her arms folded and her eyes on the middle distance. He'll try something else, she said. Probably, Colin said. It won't change what's in the cabinets. The federal hearing was on a Tuesday morning. Out. Colin wore a blue button-down shirt pressed with evident care and khaki trousers, and the boots he wore every day because they were the only dress shoes he owned that were comfortable enough to sit in for 6 hours. He carried the submission materials in 2 banker's boxes that he had labeled in black marker on the short ends. Out. He sat at the witness table and gave his account the same way he organized his repair logs, chronologically without emphasis, describing each piece of documentation as it appeared in the record. When a committee member asked why he had maintained such complete records over 8 years, he paused before answering. I was a structural engineer, he said. Engineers don't throw away data, not when the data describes a fault. It was a short answer. It accounted for 8 years. Out. Sandra Fitch presented the technical analysis that afternoon. The lot numbers, the timeline, the original internal memo, and the note on Stoll letterhead. Arthur Greer's own handwriting on his own company's stationery, directing that a known defective production batch be kept outside the regular audit process. When Arthur Greer testified the following morning, he had 5 attorneys with him and a prepared statement of considerable length. Out. By the 3rd hour of questioning, the inconsistencies between his account and the documented record had accumulated past the point where additional length could address them. The outcome came 5 weeks later. Arthur Greer was referred for criminal prosecution on charges of safety violation, concealment, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Out. Diane Stoll was formally removed from the list of primary subjects following the submission of documentation, establishing that the concealment had occurred within a division operating below her direct oversight. In the investigation report's technical appendix, Colin Mercer was cited as having provided independent third-party documentation that proved essential to establishing the full timeline of the concealment. He read the citation once, standing at the bench. Out. Then he put the report on the shelf above the parts cabinet, next to the framed photograph of Hazel at age 5 in a yellow raincoat, and went back to the frame repair he was in the middle of. The following months passed the way most months passed at Mercer Fabrication. The work was steady. A few new customers came in, people who had read the coverage and decided that a man who kept that kind of records was probably a man who would not cut corners on a repair job, which was accurate. Out. Paulette put a small card on the front of the flat file cabinets that read closed 2016-2024 and underlined it twice with a ruler. Diane came on a Friday afternoon 6 weeks before she was due back in Lexington to oversee the company's restructuring under new federal compliance requirements. She was wearing a jacket Colin had not seen before, not the suit kind, just a regular jacket, the kind a person buys in a town they didn't expect to spend time in. She was carrying a legal envelope. Out. She gave it to him without explanation. Inside were several pages of formal documentation. His name appeared in the opening paragraph. Out. The document was an attribution restoration agreement executed by the reconstituted board of Stoll Infrastructure Solutions, reinstating Colin Mercer as the original author of the SB7 structural analysis report dated 7 years prior and restoring his name to the engineering record associated with the component fault documentation that had ultimately formed the basis of the federal investigation. Out. There was also a separate agreement establishing a financial settlement figure for the unlicensed use of his proprietary technical work over the period of the deliveries. The figure was specific. It was more than he had earned in any 3-year period of his life. Colin read both documents at the bench. He read them slowly, the way he read fault analyses, looking at each item with the care it warranted. I can't give back 8 years, Diane said. No, he said, out. I can give back what's yours. He folded both documents along their original creases and set them on the bench. He did not say anything immediately. The shop was quiet in the late afternoon way, tools resting, the percolator ticking as it cooled. Did you learn anything, he said, from all of this? She thought about it. She gave it the kind of consideration she had given to the flat file folders, which was the kind of consideration things actually deserve. Out. I learned, she said finally, that records kept by someone who expects nothing from keeping them are the only records that can't be argued with. He nodded once. Hazel came in from the lot where she had been doing something with chalk on the concrete pad and walked up to Diane with the evaluative directness that had characterized every interaction she'd had with her since the first day. You're leaving today, she said, out. It was a statement, not a question, because Hazel had noted the jacket and the envelope and the quality of the afternoon light and had already concluded. Today, Diane said. Hazel looked at her for a moment. Then she said, you should come back sometime when nothing's wrong, so you can see what it actually looks like here. Diane looked at her and then at Colin. Out. What does it look like? Hazel tilted her head toward the shop, the bench, the cabinets, the pegboard, the window with the afternoon sun coming through it at a low angle across the concrete floor. Like a place where people actually fix things, she said. Not just a place where broken stuff gets dropped off. Diane looked at the room, then she looked at Colin. I know the difference now, she said quietly. Colin walked her to the car. Out. The afternoon had gone gold and cool, and the corrugated roof made a sound in the breeze that he had stopped noticing years ago. She shook his hand in the straightforward way of someone who has said what needed to be said and doesn't need to add anything. Out. He watched the black sedan move down Cutter Road and turn north, back toward Lexington and the restructured offices and the work of rebuilding a company that had been organized around concealment for long enough that it had forgotten what it looked like to do things correctly. Then he went back inside. For 8 years, Diane Stoll's company had treated the back lot of Mercer Fabrication as a place to set down its inconvenient truth. Out. What neither she nor Arthur Greer had understood was that Colin Mercer had picked up every piece of it, not because it benefited him, not because he had a plan for it, but because he was the kind of man who could not look at something broken without needing to know exactly where the damage originated, what it would cost, and whether anyone was ever going to be honest about how it got that way. He had known someday the data would matter. Out. He had just never calculated how long someday would take, or how much a person could carry in the meantime, or how quiet 8 years of being right could be before anyone thought to ask.